Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. In this, the sixth of our conversations about the nature of practice, Peter and I examine the systems dynamics of practice, the way of thinking in systems that we believe that a successful practitioner does and can always learn to do better. Both as we teach and as we learn, we can do better when we're aware of the systems that condition context and our reading of what's ahead as we advance in our practice. Here we go. Well, continuing our conversation, Peter, we've worked down through a number of conjectures about the nature of practice. And now we're at a grouping where we focus on practice as it exists in a system or context. And there's a lot to be known about that. If we can help people understand that the moment they're in practice, they're in a system in a holistic way, then perhaps we'll achieve our objective for this particular conversation.
Well, digging around in my files. Oh, by the way, thank you for bearing with me and making this connection. I've had all kinds of gremlins in my system.
Okay.
Delayed our starting this podcast by half an hour. But you remain your sunny self, and I remained with blood in my eye, ready to throw the machine across the room.
So you're saying that practice means that your emotions are involved?
I believe it does.
So what'd you find in your archives there, Peter? That you get us
well,
going?
I found a little essay I wrote about systems thinking. It's just a page, and I think I might just like to read it. It's what you might call the enemies of system thinking. The problem with thinking in systems terms is it's so easy to say that everything is connected to everything else. It's so easy to say that practice is not a series of linear relationships, but is in fact a field of relationships that exist at any time that the practice is operating, which means that a practitioner needs to become a systems thinker if he or she is not one already. So the barriers to systems thinking goes like this. Systems thinking is not an easy form of consciousness and set of skills to acquire. We continue to find ample evidence of the absence of systems awareness. We need to think no further than such common examples as the tendency to think in black and white, either or, the tendency to believe in simple linear cause-effect relationships, the tendency to ignore feedback, the tendency to ignore relationships between phenomena and its environment, the tendency to isolate a phenomenon in time, that is to say, to banish the system's relationships that exist in time, thus ignoring time-based cycles, the tendency to ignore the natural boundaries of a phenomenon in favor of what we think its boundaries should be, and the tendency to believe that we can describe a phenomenon independently of ourselves as perceivers. That is, without considering systemic interactions between ourselves and the phenomenon. All of these examples are denials of systems point of view, and we all commit them all the time. Even those of us who think we are systems thinkers, those of us who are systems thinkers commit the problem. One time I had a long commute for a number of years in my work at George Washington. And I thought to myself, and I got stuck in traffic, and I began to sort of muse on common expressions in our language and our ways of talking about things that reveal an absence of a systems point of view. And I happened to have a tablet on the seat beside me, and I just jotted down. I probably could have been arrested by the state police, but I just jotted down these phrases as they occurred to me. For example, to get on the same page. For example, straighten up and fly right. To forge ahead, and the expression full speed ahead. To get things straightened out, to get our ducks in a row. Get the kinks out, get things smoothed out, to get in the groove, to get everything lined up, to get back on track, to lay everything out, to spell everything out, to get back on the right path, to move straight ahead, get things untangled, to get things untangled. Wouldn't that be nice? If we could smoothly get things untangled, to smooth out the wrinkles, to get on the right road, to get going in the right direction, to get things sorted out. And by that time, I was at work, and so I quickly took what I'd jotted down and made an overhead projection out of it, which is why I have it today. I guess I reveal my age by saying that I was living in the age of overhead projections, but so be it. So isn't that interesting that deep within our consciousness is a tendency to lapse into either or, black and white thinking, linear logical thinking. Linear logical is one word. And so no matter how we might wish that we could be systems thinkers, it is very difficult. It has to be regarded as a learned ability, and one that the culture will keep testing you on, or keep testing the practitioner on. Now, I don't know if in the training programs that practitioners go through, if they get educated in the seductiveness of black and white either or thinking. I certainly hope they would. I've had times in my past when doctors threw up their hands and said, everything is related to everything else. And I go, you got it, buddy. Now, are you going to be able to treat it or not? Am I making any sense?
You are, and it's making me nervous to think about how many times in a day I've used exactly those cliches. And what makes me most nervous is that it's a tremendously powerful impulse to want to simplify, reduce, shorten, cut to the chase. If I were doing things that I'm used to doing as a practitioner, that wouldn't be a big deal. But it seems to me that if I'm stepping out onto new ground in with new circumstances around me, if I try to make something that I've never experienced before quickly and easily understood, I might step off that cliff and fall. So it seems that there is a need for us to learn to be more systems oriented in our thinking. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who barely get beyond black and white. So what are we offering our listeners as a solution, if there is one? See, there I go. Solution. Bam. Sum it up in 5 words or less. So it is a challenge. It's a challenge to be aware now that we've got to be better at thinking in more comprehensive and holistic ways. It's like, what do you think?
Well, somehow as a practitioner is confronted with the problems that the practice brings to him or her, there's probably a natural learning process that is available to the practitioner, that the opportunity to try to think in terms of the system the relationships, the interdependencies, the opportunity to try to think in those terms is right there. And that a skillful instructor might be able to build on the experiences that practitioners have had, things that they've seen in their practice, to increase their sensitivity to the systems relationships that exist. I might say, by the way, that the elements we're talking about, I'm sure you can add to this too. The elements we're talking about are the relationships between the practitioner and the client or the client system, the relationships between the practitioner and other practitioners who are trying to do the same thing, relationships between the world of practice of that particular practice and the larger work that's being done, the relationships between the practitioner and the technological, what would you call it? The technologies that the practice employs. Right. And we're going to be talking quite a bit more about how the practice is not a social phenomenon. It's not a social phenomenon. It's a socio-technical phenomenon. Mm-hmm. To use the phrase that was coined by the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations about 50 years ago or so.
Social technical. Okay. So it's going to get even more complicated for the practitioner when...
I'm not sure I want to go into it in detail quite at this point in this podcast, because it involves a knowledge of the technologies that a particular practice utilizes. So let me just hold that thought of the technical aspects of the practice are every bit as important and part of the system as the social side. I'm not sure, by the way, we don't want to downplay or ignore the importance of the socio part of it either. I'm not sure that way back in one of our earlier podcasts, I think we said that practice is not a personal, it's an interpersonal process.
We did.
But I just want to emphasize that again, that an effective practitioner is a skillful, interpersonally skillful, and there's a systemic relationship between the socio and the technical. It's not two independent parts. It's two interrelated parts, that are integrated with each other, where the practice is operating smoothly. And if we don't begin to sensitize the beginning practitioner or a knowledgeable practitioner who has not thought along these lines for a while, if we don't sensitize the practitioner to the fact that both sets of phenomena are interrelated and interdependent, we're not doing them a service. We're allowing them to think in black and white, either or terms. Now I'm in the socio, now I'm in the technical, now I'm in the socio, now I'm in the technical, whatever. There's another whole dimension to this issue that I think I'd like to raise at this point. A dimension to the system's problem, so to speak. And that is that, as I like to say, change itself is changing. Systemic relationships themselves are changing. The socio-technical problem of 40 years ago is not the socio-technical problem of today. So that right as we are trying to get in touch with the systemic relationships that exist in a practice, those very relationships are undergoing fairly rapid change in some practices they're undergoing explosive change.
Mm-hmm.
My impression is that the practice that you might call web page designer, that practice, which did not exist 25 years ago, now exists full blown and is changing at a very rapid pace, developing at a very rapid pace. One of the young nurses that I see on a regular basis has just completed a master's degree in web page design. And
probably thought you were talking about her.
has just completed a master's degree in web page design, and particularly web pages that have a fluid quality to them, web pages that have characters that walk and talk, cartoon relationships. The computer design and programming problem of producing these extraordinary web pages. She graduated 2 or 3 years ago, and her degree is now obsolete. She's finding in the positions that she interviews for that she needs to know how to do things that were not part of her program when she started. And
change itself is changing, and for her, and even though she's relatively up to date, within a very few months now, she's got to go back and learn a whole other bunch of elements in order to be useful. That's frustrating, but it's real.
Change itself is changing because we have multiple cross-cutting changes in organizations. We're seeking deeper interchange. For example, trust. How many companies are trying to build trust in their workforces? When 40 years ago they weren't trying to do anything as exotic as that. All they wanted was a day's work out of people. We're using flatter, leaner structures and trying to manage our change processes, our systems change in those contexts. Another one that I think is really important is that change these days is more threat driven and not as opportunity driven. Gosh, when I think of how opportunity driven change was in the 60s and 70s, when I was just getting started, nobody in the room was frightened, afraid of losing their job, of getting laid off. Everybody in the room had 2 or 3 offers. Everybody in the room was constructing souped up resumes that they knew would get them an offer. Threat-driven change is an entirely different phenomenon. And threat-driven change is the systemic aspect of that, where a person is feeling a threat from multiple sides, so to speak. I think of a practitioner who is in a threat-driven matrix of relationships. Another one that I think is very important is that technology itself is not under control. Technology is exploding at its own rate, in its own way. All of this is going on a very disturbed infrastructure, full of unexpected surprises itself. And all of this is likely to continue indefinitely.
Yes.
To enter a field of practice today is a heroic act.
I love that phrase. To enter a field of practice is a heroic act. Do you hear that, folks? And when you're in a field of practice, you're doing what you most want to do in life, so it's hard to avoid it. On the other hand, there are other easier ways to make $1 or $2. But when you're setting yourself up to become a practitioner of worth to yourself and others, you're right out here. And now what Peter's saying, and I certainly observe it every day, is there's so many more evident threats than there are opportunities. And it's not going to get that much easier going forward. So what do we do, Peter? Fold our arms and go to sleep and never wake up? You're scaring the hell out of me. There's got to be some hope here, right?
A smart aleck way to answer that question is, I'd rather be a professor of threat-driven change than a member of a threat-driven practice myself.
Yes.
And yet, you and I are now members of threat-driven practices.
Yes, we are.
All kinds of things are being done within the world of academe and the world of the practice of training and development that constitute more of a threat-driven than an opportunity-driven practice, where layoffs and so forth are very common. I know a number of university presidents who are looking for ways to reduce the number of tenure track appointments they have on their books.
That's right.
Because with tenure track appointments, you don't have the flexibility of laying them all off if you feel like it.
True.
And right now in the academic world, it's very what thousands and thousands of younger faculty members are going through is the knowledge that they're only an adjunct and that they can be laid off at any time. That was simply an unheard of feeling when you and I were starting out.
Very true. Never even occurred to me that that kind of insecurity would be ahead in academia, at least. And more, I'm familiar with people whose sons and daughters have earned PhDs and who are teaching at 2 or 3 different schools just to put together enough money to pay their rent. So these are the times. And the same probably would be true of many, many of the once stable sectors like K-12 teaching and ministry. And, we can go down the list of fields of practice, and maybe that would be a good exercise for people who listen to this podcast, and ask yourself, how has change that's changing faster than ever made it such that I'm seeing more threat than opportunity here? And then what do I have to do to stay in the game, to stay at it? Because basically, this is who I am. I'm a teacher. I need to be teaching. So what do we tell them, Peter?
Well, we tell them punt or something.
Yeah, drop back and punt. That's the one for your list.
Well, but see, the point is, we're talking about what's it like to learn to live in a context of continual change among some systemic relationships. It's always important to remind ourselves that we're talking about systemic relationships, not simple, easy cause-effect relationships.
Right.
What is the learning process? I've had plenty of learners in programs I've taught where they'll stick their hand up and say, well, this is pretty colorful stuff you're talking about here, Peter. However, I must tell you that I thrive on this stuff. I wouldn't have it any other way. I love to wrestle with these kinds of puzzles. I'm reminded, I may have mentioned this in an earlier podcast, I'm reminded of Russell Akoff, who was writing about complexity and interdependence and change and systemic relationships and so forth. And he said, English lacks a good word to describe a system of systemic relationships which are themselves changing. However, so I have had to coin one. Okay. I choose to call it a mess. I choose to call it a mess. Well, so
there you go.
The obvious task is to learn to live in the mess. And I have to say that a lot of us instructors and teachers and so forth are simply not qualified to help men and women learn to live in the mess. Too many of us are still stuck back in the days when there were just one or two things you needed to know.
Right.
A simple theory of motivation, a simple theory of predicting the behavior of a problem. And it's not that simple. And I think we need another podcast to do the best we can to talk about living in the mess.
I think that would be a very interesting one, because it is right here in my world at this moment. Not just this, but my daughter happens to be home overnight. She's a nurse working in a hospital where they bring the people in by helicopter. She's in the OR, and she made it home last night here to my house and sat down and just said, just let me be quiet. Give me a half an hour to get these different images out of her head. And she wrote a beautiful little piece about what it is to be a nurse these days, socially or technically, in the midst of all this high tech. At the same time, you're looking at a person who's on that table and who might not make it off that table alive. And you deal with it, and then the next thing you know, they're going to bring another one in. So my own daughter, who is a very smart person and does love risk and adventure, has to figure out how to live in the mess if she's going to make a living. Because I'm not independently wealthy, and I can't set her up in grand style to not have to work. And she's probably like tens of thousands of people who now, in her age, 50, paid all the dues, got all the certificates. Everyone pats them on the back and says, you're doing great, but don't screw up tomorrow or you're out of here. So that would be an interesting conversation to have, Peter. We are moving toward our limit for the patience of listeners for this episode. What do we reinforce that's very important for a practitioner to know about living in systems and in swimming in permanent whitewater?
I do believe that's true, because if we don't find ways of learning to live in the mess or continuing to live in the mess as it becomes more and more crazy, whole practices seems to me they're threatened as to their very existence if their practitioners can't maintain the practice under the new conditions. Wow. Or they are replaced. They may be replaced by practitioners who are somehow able to live in the mess more effectively than the more mature practitioners of today.
It's maybe because those newcomers don't have the depth of knowledge that's constantly telling the more experienced person, this isn't like anything you've seen before. And you're making those comparisons between your past history and experience and the current state. Bring in a newbie who has never seen anything like it before and has no knowledge of it. It's fresh for them. They're going to plunge right in. What I think is a middle ground is one way, and you wrote about this in at least two of your books, is we are going to have to learn how to be beginners again, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we can weave that into the next podcast, because I think that's the feeling, that you just got to put that beginner head on, and you've got to be a different kind of learner than the conventions and the methodical step-by-step kind of instruction that we have perpetrated on our students for generations.
So, and we are not teaching students, we're not even mentioning this problem, that these issues make beginners of us all, continual beginners of us all. Mm-hmm. There are, as far as I know, very few, if any, teachers, trainers, whatever, who are standing up in front of their groups and saying, welcome to a world in which you will be in a perpetual beginning mode, where you're going to be feeling like you're learning to keep up with the pace of change, and it's not going to stop. That's what you've bought into. And if you have not realized that, I invite you to leave now. or rethink your own priorities and your own expectations and needs. It is a different ball game than you may have thought. And closing on a perhaps somewhat crazy note, some years ago, a systems thinker named Charles Lindblom wrote an essay called Management and the Art of Chinese Baseball.
I remember that article.
Have you ever heard of that one?
I have.
It's really old now. You'd have to dig deep to find it. I'm sure Google has it.
I think they call it it's a monograph. It's so old. But he had a point.
But briefly, American baseball is a series of systemic relationships, but it is so settled in its style that you hardly realize it's a system of relationships. Everybody knows them so well, and the expectations of how things are going to go are so well established. But anyway, management in the art of Chinese baseball. Chinese baseball is just like American baseball in all respects, except that whenever the ball is in the air, anyone is allowed to pick up any base and move it anywhere.
Oh.
And it's a little hard to picture that. And I assume that Lindblom was joking, that this metaphor came to him in a flash in a bar or at night or somewhere. and he realized he could make good use of it in talking about the complicated world that managers increasingly live in. But I have met people who claim that it's real and that they do play Chinese baseball in China, or they practice it.
And now we call it trade. And we have a trade war.
Yes. Yes.
I think a lot of people are running around picking up the bases when the ball's in the air. Well, this has been fun. And as I said, it's chilling and thrilling. We're talking about beginning again, and in order to stay in the mess, and maybe we'll even have another chapter at some point says, well, there's a way of de-messing, removing some of the messiness of life. You can always hope, but I'm pretty sure that probably isn't true. Anyway, thank you, Peter.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Talking again soon.